Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us this afternoon for the webinar, Brexit, Where Do We Go From Here? My name is Eva Lutaya, and I'm a program advisor for the strategy and negotiation programs at Saïd Business School, University of Oxford. If there's any questions that you may have about our programs or the school more broadly, then please do send across your questions during our Q&A later this afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome Paul Fisher, Director of the Oxford Program on Negotiation, and Janet Smart, Reader in Operations Management at Saïd Business School, who through this webinar will examine what we can learn from the negotiation errors of the past and how we can inject the crucial concepts of trust, reciprocity, and mutual value creation back into negotiation. Paul, Janet, we are excited to hear from you today.
Thank you, Eva.
Thank you very much, Eva. Well, firstly, thank you so much for all of you joining us today. When we talked about holding this seminar, one of the things we were slightly concerned about was Brexit fatigue for a process that has dominated so many of our lives and the news for nearly 3 years. So I'm delighted that I've been proved wrong and that you're all as engaged in the process as you've always been. What I'd also like to say at the outset is in this webinar today, we don't intend to get into the political details and the specific characters and the various parliamentary processes. What I'd like to do really is take a step back and look at the whole Brexit process from both a negotiation point of view and utilising Janet's expertise and operational standpoint. What I'd also like to do is make this webinar as informal as possible, almost like a fireside chat where myself and Janet will discuss various issues. But please feel free, if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to send them through during the webinar, and my trusty sidekicks, Eva and Simon, will pass them on to us. So I'd like this to be as interactive as possible, and I look forward to spending the next 45 minutes talking about this crucial process. So without further ado, Janet, we are here now on Wednesday, April the 10th, another seminal day. We've had many of these days in the Brexit process where big decisions are going to be made. Tonight, the EU leaders will sit down over their, no doubt, very nice meal in Brussels, and they will decide whether to grant the UK another extension of Article 50 or say no with the UK leaving the European Union at 11 p.m. on Friday. So to give you an easy question to kick off, Janet, what do you think will happen tonight?
Well, what I hope will happen tonight is that we'll be granted a longer extension, because there's no way we're going to be ready operationally for a no-deal Brexit on Friday. It's just a matter of hope that we will be able to succeed or survive as a functioning economy without with a no-deal situation.
Yeah, I think it's likely that we will be given an extension tonight. What is actually interesting over the last few days is we've seen the first real splits between the 27 countries remaining in the European Union, particularly between Germany and France, in terms of how long this extension will go on for. And it's perhaps almost an indictment of the UK's negotiation strategy, that this is really the first time that we're seeing real divisions between the European countries. So I also think the EU doesn't want to be seen on the wrong side of history. We're almost moving towards the potential blame game scenarios, and obviously it's within their interest as well to ensure that we have an orderly withdrawal from the European Union. There's also the concern, I might add, that if we continue within the European Union over the next few months, we need to be reliable partners. And there's been certain tweets from various Conservative politicians about being very difficult. So I think we will have some fairly strict guidelines moving forward as to how much we can be involved in future budgets and in the selection of the new personnel at the top of the European Union. So it'll be interesting to see what happens tonight. Janet, I have another question for you then. So we are now actually 3 years on, almost 3 years on from the momentous decision in June 2016. Is it fair to say, and this is slightly depressing suggestion, that we aren't really much further forward than we were back then?
Sadly, I would agree with you there, Paul. I think negotiation-wise, we haven't made a lot of progress. But I think operationally, people are a bit better informed. They know more about what would be the actuality of moving out of the EU than that seemed to be the case 3 years ago.
Interesting. Yes, I mean, and actually that links into one of the principles we talk about on our program in Oxford is actually the sunk cost argument. And that essentially is the idea that because we have spent so much time and resources focusing on a particular way forward, that we must continue to plough along the same path. So what I suggest there is I think it's important to understand that what has happened, and we need to start thinking about the future. And certainly from a negotiation perspective, and I would talk a little bit about some of the errors over the last 3 years, but it is salvageable. There are things we can do to move forward and ultimately have a healthy relationship with the European Union moving forward. So do you think the whole process was fairly predictable from the moment that Theresa May invoked Article?
Well, I think the fact that Theresa May's red lines were not compatible, and I think and the expectation and hope that somehow technology would be able to solve these inconsistencies was a forlorn hope right from the start. I think although when there had been very little discussion before the referendum of what would be the operational impacts on supply chains like just-in-time manufacturing and on exporting across a border, there'd been little discussion about that. People just weren't interested, weren't inclined to learn about it. But I think now that people are becoming more aware and they realise that it's not just project fear, it is undeniable. You know, queues form, their behaviour is predictable. It's like denying the reality of gravity or physics to say, no, we don't need to worry about those sorts of things. I think another big thing that's come true is that the things that people had said might be able to solve the Irish border problem, where you know, technology and trusted trader schemes, but again, without having done their homework on how feasible those things would be. As you can maybe tell by now, I'm from a part of the world that is particularly going to be afflicted by a hard Brexit. I grew up about 12 miles from the border with Ireland, so to the northern side. So it's something I've been asking a lot of questions about.
Very good. Well, do we have a question? I think we have our first question, which has come through. Are the negative parliamentary votes in the UK based on substantive issues or political issues, and to embarrass the Prime Minister? That's a good question, Janet.
That is a good question, and a difficult one to answer, because I mean, I don't have an idea on what's going on in the heads of the parliamentarians who are making these votes, but so it's hard to tell how well informed they are. I think it's clear that some of them do know and acknowledge and accept the operational realities, but there are others who I'm sure are voting on other assumptions.
Yeah, I mean,
other models.
I think domestic political considerations have dominated the negotiations from the outset, and I'd say that links into probably Theresa May's single biggest mistake at the outset, was to focus too much on her own domestic political audiences without really making a huge attempt to understand the European Union's interests, incentives, motives. It was very much focusing on domestic consumption. I think sadly that has happened over the last 3 years. We talk in our program, we talk about one of the most important things is understanding the person that you're, or the organisation you're negotiating with, and really trying to move beyond positions to the underlying interests. And sadly, that hasn't happened here. And the focus from the outset on, I remember the Lancaster House speech back in 2017, was all red lines. It was all, we must do this, we must do that, we must be out of the customs union, we must not be under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. And it was very much focused on that, rather than actually trying to reach out and get a consensus. And I think the fact that she's now actually started speaking to the Labour Party, it'll be interesting to see where that develops. But sadly, I think that's probably 2 to 3 years too late. I think there needed to be, and I think we're seeing this in Parliament now with the factionalism there. We're not seeing, a move towards a consensus, because essentially we're leaving the European Union together as a country, and how we do it will have ramifications as a country for many years to come. Yes, that was a bit of a lecture there. I'd like to talk a little bit.
Can I just follow up on one of
Yes.
the points that you were making there, because you were saying that Theresa May was addressing her internal political audience, but I think as well there were mistakes made in the discussions with the public. You know, the public were misled that it would be the easiest negotiation ever. So the possibility that these negotiations might take time was closed down again from the start, so that the negotiations started in haste without the extensive homework having been done.
Absolutely. I think you've hit the nail on the head, Janet. I mean, preparation is absolutely essential in negotiation. And we talk on our programme at Oxford, negotiations often fail or succeed based on the preparation which takes place in advance, before you even get to the table. And that really didn't happen here. When we invoked Article 50, there was no clear strategy to move forward, whereas the European Union had a clear strategy. And the fact that they said they wouldn't start negotiations until the clock had started ticking, and so Article 50 had been invoked, meant that we were always going to be under considerable time pressures. And it's not massively surprising that we're in the position we are today. I have another question here, actually, about sequencing, which is it's a very, very interesting one, about the sequencing of the negotiations, which I think is quite an important one to bring out. In negotiation, we argue that you should have as many issues on the table as possible. The more issues which are on the table, the more opportunities there are to create value, to trade issues which are of low cost to you but high value to your counterpart, and vice versa. The fact that we agreed at the outset to agree on the parameters around our withdrawal before going on to the future trade agreement meant that a lot of the leverage was taken off the table. So the 39 billion that we agreed in terms of the divorce bill should ideally have been on the table at the same time as discussing potential customs unions, potential trade agreements. So I think this linear approach, while it worked very well for the European Union, was not particularly effective for us. And I think probably it's going to be too late to move away from this linear approach now. And I fear that, for example, if we have a no deal, we will be going straight back to the huge issues that we were addressing before in terms of the Irish border and the rights of European citizens and the divorce bill. So unfortunately, it is slightly Groundhog Day. Janet, do you want to add?
No, I would agree with that. That no matter what is agreed this week, we'll be negotiating these matters for years to come. You know, these negotiations, this is just the start. There'll be many, many negotiations to follow.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that sort of, you probably don't want to hear this, but really the negotiations haven't even really started. The tough stuff is still to come. At the moment, we're just looking at the withdrawal agreement. I mean, to give an analogy, the European Union recently signed a free trade agreement with Canada, and that took 7 years. Incredibly complex. And we also have to remember the fact that as a country, we haven't negotiated a single trade agreement since 1973. So when we joined the European Union, we've always relied on European Union trade negotiators. So there's a capacity issue there as well. So, I mean, I have a question here which sort of links into this in terms of what do you think the government should have done differently to avoid this situation? And I'd like to link that into what we should do moving forward. And I think one of the key things to do will be to increase our ability to negotiate in terms of working with the best, drawing the best UK nationals from the Commission, the World Trade Organization, universities, law firms. We need experts in all sides of trade deal policy, intellectual property, financial services, government procurement. There needs to be a huge investment there, because we are essentially going to be in a permanent state of negotiation with the European Union. Switzerland has 120 bilateral deals with the European Union. Switzerland, which is outside the European Union. So that just gives you an idea of the challenges we face moving forward.
Yeah, I would also like to speak up for the practicalities, the practical sides as well, so that understanding what investments will have to be made in IT, equipment, in recruitment of new staff and training them before we can have a lot of the operational projects up and running. I think that's been overlooked as well in the past.
Absolutely. I have another question here, Janet. If you were the PM,
Mm.
how would you answer the questions why now, and what for? I'm not quite sure if I can answer those. I'm glad I'm asking you that question.
Oh, sure. Why now, and what
for? Why? As in, why are we?
Why are we doing this?
Why are we doing this? Well, that's a question I think we've asked.
I know we've all been tearing our hair out trying to get an answer to that question. I think that question would be best answered according to whichever time scale you're interested in the future. We'll have different answers to that question. You know, this will be a question for the historians that be answering in the next 5, 10, 50, 100 years. Why did they do this? Why now? I think this is all a sort of sociological questions. And what for? That's, I think we thought we knew, but now we're beginning to realize that it was perhaps not as clear-cut and straightforward as we thought.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting. I was reading an article this morning from Peter Oborne, who's a columnist on Daily Mail and was always a very keen Brexiteer, and he has recanted. He has decided that it simply isn't worth it. Having seen what we've seen over the last 2 years, and realizing that, you know, we do not have, as a small country of only 66 million, we do not have the weight to negotiate anything like the kind of trade deals that the European Union can negotiate as a bloc. And we're already seeing that. I mean, the fact is that Liam Fox has signed up very few trade deals already. And a lot of countries like Japan, Australia, United States are holding out because they were going to have a lot of leverage over it. So again, it's going to put our negotiation expertise to the ultimate test in terms of trying to negotiate deals which are better than the European Union, which I don't think is possible. So I don't know. The why now is certainly a very pertinent question. I think we're all asking ourselves that at different times. Another question: what advice would you give to the PM as to how to handle negotiations moving forward? Well, that's a very good question. There's a few things I would advise her on. I've talked about the capacity. I think it's very important to build up our negotiating capacity. I think at the outset, a lot of it has been very much focused on a fairly narrow group within Ollie Robbins' team in number 10, although there's a lot of work going on in the different departments, and we've had some outstanding civil servants actually come on our programme at Oxford who are doing fantastic work and at times feeling slightly frustrated by their political masters. But I think we need to build up our capacity. I think we need to work closer with all the stakeholders, which we haven't done to date. We need to bring business on board, unions, political parties. I think we need to be better on gathering intelligence from the EU as well in terms of their positions. You know, we have to, we have diplomatic missions in all these countries, and we need to really ask what they want and really focus, move from positions to interests. So it's not too late. I mean, we have the. Ideally, I think it'd be easier to be within the European Union, but it is possible to create a good relationship moving forward to bring back trust into negotiations as well. It's all been really rather puerile and over the last, very childish at times, the threats going back and forth. But anyway, Janet, you probably have some more. I'm taking up.
No, I would agree with that. I think, and going forward, I think as well, we need to do some realistic homework about, for example, checking what is available to free up transit across borders. We don't know enough about that right now as a government, and we need to do some good reaching out and researching what's going on around the world. People sometimes compare the Sweden-Norway border as one that because one's inside the customs union and the other one isn't. Completely different to the Irish border. There's only 8 crossing places there. The Irish border is 500 kilometres long and there's 200 crossing places. So what kind of magical technology is going to be available to make that frictionless? And if we do some of the checks away from the border, again, that's going to lead to delays and hold-ups. So, there needs to be some practical, realistic modelling of how how close the UK can get to a frictionless border, whether it's across the Irish border or to the rest of the EU, to the ports of England.
Yeah. So, if we left, I know you mentioned this briefly before, but if we did leave on Friday, or I think no deal certainly remains on the table, and it will be on the table for the next few months. I mean, what do you think the immediate impact would be? I mean, is it project fear or?
No, I think it's project actuality, because there will have to be hold-ups at all the border crossings into the EU, because checks will have to be done. For example, all the paperwork, there will be additional paperwork that the exporters and importers will have to put in place. At the minute, small companies don't know what that is. They don't have any expertise or have had any practice in that. They're bound to be getting things wrong. They don't know if their insurance will work. They don't have international driver's permits. So a lot of the lorries won't be able to legally cross from Dover to Calais and elsewhere. It's the phytosanitary checks that would have to be carried out on animals and dairy products at the Irish border. There is no infrastructure in place that would enable that. So there is no way for the EU to check that the goods that are moving into the single market are valid or safe. And it's just unthinkable what could happen.
I mean, would a customs union, would that solve all those problems?
It won't solve all the problems, but our customs union would be better than no customs union. The customs union that we currently have, of course, is working well. But to achieve our customs union, which would allow us to have some kind of divergence later, will take some time to negotiate.
I mean, I think it's interesting, the talk of the customs union, which has obviously gone up the agenda over the last couple of weeks, with Theresa May reaching out to the Labour Party. I mean, I think it's important to stress that the customs union won't necessarily, it's not something you can just take off the shelf and it will be business as usual. You know, there'll be a lot of other areas to negotiate as well. On services, for example, we haven't talked that much about services. 3/4 of the British economy is dependent on services. So we talk a lot about very vital areas like automotive and the supply chain and manufacturing, but services as well is a crucial area that hasn't really been covered at all yet. So services, intellectual property, public procurement, and standards. I mean, we look at the customs union. For example, Turkey is a member of the customs union. But from what I've heard, lorries going from Turkey to Bulgaria into the European Union to spend 6 to 7 hours there is quite a good day. So I think we need to appreciate that as well. There is quite a big difference between the customs union and the single market, and it will require a huge amount of negotiation as well. It's not something we can just take off the shelf and move forward. So good.
Absolutely.
I have another question. I have a few questions here actually. It's great. Everyone is so engaged. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get through all of them. So I'm very happy to continue this discussion. A question here: how much has populism, public opinion, affected this negotiation compared to a business negotiation where there is less public pressure? I mean, I think that's very interesting. I think this is probably the most complex negotiation I've certainly ever come across, with all the different stakeholders. We talk a lot on our program about stakeholder management, and there's such a variety of stakeholders and such intense domestic pressure and polarized views that so I would say that it is potentially, but of course there's plenty of business negotiations as well, which are extremely complex, where they have a wide variety of stakeholders. And if you don't get it right in a business negotiation, it can be just as damaging, or quite as damaging as Brexit. But there's interesting comparisons to make between the two. Janet, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very interesting question, because the role of populism and expressing to the public, because I think in a political negotiation like this, there has to be some declaration of interest to the public to keep them informed of how things are going along. People want to know, is there progress being made, and when they can expect the whole thing to stop. So to some extent, the progress has to be simplified in order to present it in a feasible soundbite on News at 10 to the public. But what the crossover into populism is when people believe there is a simple answer. You know, there might be a simple summary of what's going on, but a simple answer there is not. And so, populism can have an unpleasant effect as a result.
Absolutely, absolutely. A couple of very interesting questions here. is there any way of imposing some kind of framework around such large-scale negotiations to avoid the kind of mistakes that have been made? And I'd say absolutely. I mean, that's what we've kind of discussed to a certain extent earlier in terms of establishing a process. And the European Union is brilliant at process, and they are a skilled, patient, and at times brutal negotiator. And they've been very effective in establishing the whole process around these negotiations, which has ensured, sadly, that it's been almost inevitable that we've moved to this situation. So firstly, agreeing between all 27, and they agreed this within hours of us deciding to leave the European Union, that there would be no negotiation before Article 50 was invoked, and then to agree on the sequencing where the withdrawal agreement would have to be determined first before we could even talk about the future relationship. And the political declaration we have here, I don't know if many people have had a chance to read it, but it's very, very vague. It's not legally binding, so it's something which is going to have to be worked on for many years in the future. So absolutely, and this is what we talk about on our program. You know, framework and process is absolutely essential, and sometimes it can really derail negotiations. An example I give on the program is the American-Vietnam peace talks in the early 70s. This was actually between the North and South Vietnamese. They were delayed by about 3 months because they couldn't agree on the shape of the table. And so, it's things like that which seem incredibly petty, but if you cannot establish that process and establish expectations before the negotiation takes place, you will run into roadblocks, as we've done in this case. So, Janet.
Yeah, I remember again back in the day when the Troubles were in place in Northern Ireland, and I think people were trying to find a way out of it. There was always talks about talks, that they're having talks about talks. And as a youngster, I would wonder, what's a talk about a talk? But you know, it's what you're saying. It's exactly setting up those processes and preparatory arrangements.
Absolutely. Yeah. Another question we have here: are all negotiations based on an underlying objective? This is not clear to me on Brexit. What outcome is the UK looking for? That's a very good question. I think. Would you like to?
Well, that again is one of these questions about the nature of the UK and how it sees itself right now. You know, what does it want to achieve? Where does it want to be as a global player? And I think that's what it's trying to achieve. But coming out of the EU may not be the way, if there is a way of restoring the UK standing in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I certainly agree that objectives and goals are absolutely crucial to negotiations. Well, one thing we talk about on our program is BATNA. I don't know if anyone's come across BATNA. It's called the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, and ideally you should always have a BATNA. And the stronger your BATNA is, your alternative, when you want to walk away from the table, the more effective you're going to be in the negotiation. And one thing I'd say with this one is the BATNA has always been very weak in terms of the alternative here is not to have a deal at all. It's to walk away from the table and fall off the cliff and go to WTO rules. So that has never been very strong. I mean, a case could be said that we might have tried to improve that BATNA by preparing a bit better over the last couple of years, which we clearly haven't really done. But that's a very important part of negotiation strategy as well. So do we have any other questions at the moment? We've had a lot of questions coming through. I've got one question here about how tough do we think the second phase of the negotiations will be once we finally get to a stage where we can talk about the future relationship. I mean, I'm happy to kick off there. I think they're going to be really tough, extremely tough. The EU will support each other. So whether it's to do with fishing rights or Gibraltar, they're going to be very, very strong working together. And clearly they have their priorities and interests, which is the future integrity of the European Union, the integrity of the single market, and they won't allow us as a country to in any way derail that. So I think it's going to be very tough, but I think it makes it all the more important for us, for our leaders, to be straight with us, to have an honest, realistic debate about what leaving the European Union entails. You know, there's going to be tough trade-offs. We're going to struggle to achieve things. We're going to, you know, ironically, we're trying to take back control, but in many cases, we're going to be left as an observer status where other countries are setting policies which will have a huge impact on our national life without us actually having any say in it. So I think we just need to be honest, and we need leadership as well. I think leadership is crucial, setting out a vision, doing the homework, and we can get something out of this. Janet?
No, I would agree with that as well, that going forward we need to, as you've been saying before, we need to learn from our mistakes, avoid the sunk costs, and say, right, we're going to approach this with realistic assessments of what it is that we want, harking back to that earlier question, and what is available to us to achieve that technologically and operationally, and how long it's going to take. Setting out the options that are available to us and thinking them through in some depth and detail.
Absolutely. I think another point to make is we talked the transition period in terms of actually going towards a full agreement is December 2020. That will be obviously moved back if we have an extension to Article 50, but that's not going to be enough time.
It's not long.
We need longer than that. To have a fully detailed trade agreement with the European Union is essential, and time doesn't always help. We often say in negotiation, if you're up against time, bad decisions get made. And I'd argue at the moment, this is probably the worst time for us to make huge decisions about our future. Parliamentarians, they look exhausted. Theresa May looks exhausted. We don't want to rush into decisions which we're going to regret in the future. And of course, again, we have domestic issues as well. It's quite possible that we're going to have a Conservative leadership campaign where the rest of the country will be put aside and the candidates will be targeting less than 140,000 people who not necessarily are representatives of the country, but members of the Conservative Party. So domestic politics is going to be very much part of it. Janet,
I agree with that. But it's unbelievable how things have worked out. If as fiction, you would have thought, no, there are just too many weird coincidences. But nobody would ever believe this is a work of fiction. But here we are.
Yes, here we are. Indeed. I have another question. We're going to wrap up in a couple of minutes. What has brought us to this point? Well, obviously we've covered a lot of those issues on the call today. We've created more chaos and uncertainty in the world. I wouldn't argue with that. What are factors are at play here to create this situation? Well, I think we discussed a lot of that as well. The red lines, the lack of preparation, the lack of understanding of where the European Union is coming from. And it's it seems very depressing that tonight it's not really a negotiation in Brussels. It's really a declaration of terms by the European Union. So we've got to this stage now that there is no, such as Theresa May being boxed in, and we have the timings and the pressure, that the European Union will decide tonight how long an extension to give us, and we will have to just say thank you very much. There's no real room for wiggle room at all. So this is, unfortunately, the European Union has probably got us exactly where they want, and it's yes, it's if only we could turn the clock back 2.5 years. Another question, do you think the fact that May is a woman has affected the negotiations, and how they are viewed by the public? That's an interesting. We talk about gender and negotiations on our program. Janet, would you?
That is an interesting one, and it's one I've thought of a little bit as well, because there are some elements of the public, some elements of the press that are unkind to women, but I think we've had a number of female contributors who played quite an important role, such as Nicola Sturgeon, Arlene Foster, head of the DUP,
absolutely,
Angela Merkel. These are all women who've been quite prominent in the negotiations so far.
Leading members of the cabinet, Amber Rudd.
Oh, absolutely, Andrea Leadsom. So I think my reading of it is that there have been fools and idiots on both sides, on both genders.
Yes. Very good.
Perhaps you'd like to say something more.
No, I'm very happy with what you said there, Janet. I don't think gender has been a huge issue in this. Gender is a dynamic in the negotiations, and we do talk about it a bit on our program, but I don't think it's been a massive issue in these negotiations at all. So I think we have one more question, and then we'll probably hand over to Eva to wrap up. There's so many things we've discussed so many things really in this last 35 minutes. I hope your heads aren't spinning too much. We're very happy to continue the conversation if you have any questions. We cover all these issues really on our programme. We try not to focus too much on Brexit in our programme. We hold twice a year, but we very much focus on a lot of the issues discussed today in terms of preparation, avoiding red lines, and all those areas. Here's another question. Is saving a party worth sacrificing a country? Well, that's a great question. Janet.
Well, you give me the easy ones, don't you?
Yes, yeah. Well, I could start. I'd say absolutely no.
Yeah, I would say that too.
Yeah.
I think that the interesting thing about this Brexit negotiation is that it has exposed the UK for what we are. I think a lot of the myths and beliefs that people had are being severely tested by Brexit, and so our political processes are also being hugely challenged, as we've seen with all the indicative votes and the new processes that have been introduced in Parliament. So I think Brexit is going to create a lot of upheaval and turmoil in the years to come, but it's definitely not. A country is more important than
absolutely,
a party.
absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's particularly sad that we've got to this situation in terms of being party political. So because we've always had a reputation as a country, really, certainly internationally, for both diplomacy and pragmatism.
Absolutely.
And in both cases, we've lost that reputation over the last few years. And I work quite a lot in Brussels, and we've always had absolutely outstanding people at the Commission. And I mean, a lot of my colleagues from other European countries say how much they'll miss the UK's influence in Europe. We're very important in terms of being a bulwark between Germany and France, and we have so outstanding people. So I'd say no, absolutely not. Country comes before party every time. So we'll see what happens over the next few weeks.
That was great, Janet and Paul. Unfortunately, we have run out of time to answer any further questions. We had a lot more questions, but unfortunately, we haven't been able to get to them. But we will follow up on them after the webinar. I would just like to conclude this webinar by thanking you, Paul and Janet, for your time today. That was a very interesting conversation and useful insight from you. So thank you very much. And I would also like to thank our audience for taking the time to join us today. For those of you who wish to dive deeper into psychology of negotiations and learn how to confidently establish trust with all parties for the best mutual outcome, then please take a look at Saïd Business School's Oxford program on negotiation. The next program dates are shown on the screen. If anyone has further questions at all, my contact details are also here on the screen, so please feel free to contact me via phone, email, or LinkedIn. Thank you very much for joining the webinar today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.